Welcome to the webinar. This time it's focusing on youth exclusion from the digital world and ways youth work can play a role in including young people. My name is Laimonas Ragauskas. I'm from the NGO Nectarus, and I'm one of the course facilitators and I'm also coordinator of MOOC on digital youth work. The whole project is coordinated by the Lithuanian National Agency of Erasmus+. It's supported also by this national agency in cooperation with a number of other national agencies, as well as Salto Participation and Information and the youth partnership between European Union and Council of Europe. This webinar is part of the whole MOOC on digital youth work, and in particular, it's part of module 2. And in the module 2, we are looking at the digitalization of society, what impact it has on youth work. Today, we have a guest speaker, Dan Moxon, who is director at People, Dialogue and Change. And also Dan is a member of European Union, Council of Europe, Pool of European Youth Researchers. So Dan gonna be bringing also some evidence-based knowledge to this webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think it's afternoon for most of us. You've got a lot of the sort of things that would be my take on this Padlet, but in very different proportions, I think. So you see on here, you're talking about people's digital access, whether they have actual broadband connectivity and the devices to use, people talking about digital skills, people talking about whether things are accessible and usable to people with disabilities, and a couple of comments about safety, which I think is a very important one that I'd like to pull out. But the main focus of what you're talking about here is basically whether people have access to good quality internet. What I'd like to do is share with you my thoughts around what I think, maybe not so much what the main barriers are, but a useful way of thinking about the barriers to young people accessing informal education or youth work online. We saw from your opening mentee, most of you are, the most common profession is a youth worker. So this is very much pitched at people who are basically in the middle of the COVID situation thinking, how do we deliver what we might have done in person or face-to-face in a virtual or digital realm. And I'm going to share my screen with you. One of the ways I think is really important to think about digital work in our space is to really consider it as spaces and communities. We talk a lot about digital tools sometimes, but a tool is a means to an end. A tool is something you use to create something. And I think a lot of what we create in the youth workspace and in the online youth workspace is about building small spaces for communities to come together and interact with each other. And if we start to relate the idea of the virtual world to that a little bit more, we can use some of the skills that I think our sector has to think very strongly about how we can make sure those spaces are inclusive, accessible and welcoming to people from a wide variety of different backgrounds. Some of the stuff I'm going to be drawing on is in a study on social inclusion, digitalization and young people that I've done with a couple of other colleagues for the Youth Partnership, and there's also an upcoming knowledge book around that. But as well as this, I'm drawing a lot on my practice experience over the last few months. I've run digital programs for young people with chronic illness and done a lot of work supporting people in different parts of the world around digitalization. I think the youth sector skills are actually quite low in this area. So I think you can be elevated to the position of an expert on digitalization if you owned a Zoom account before COVID happened. So I'm not going to pretend that I have all of the answers, because I don't think the youth sector as a whole has all of the answers to how we work inclusively. But I think I can show you where some of the challenges that we face are. So if I was going to think about what are the barriers to people accessing online programs, to accessing online youth work programs, the one you've touched on a lot is not having suitable internet connection and devices. But I think it's important to dig into the data around that, because I think we perhaps make a little bit too much of this in some places, and we need to think about it a little bit more subtly. This graph shows you the number of young people aged 16 to 29 who use the internet on a daily basis. This was last year. The blue crosses at the top, the young people, and the yellow squares, let's call them the old people. And you can see this is by country, and it reflects what Laimonas says. This is across the EU. And what you're talking about is that 95% of young people in 2019 were using the internet daily. Now, not all countries are equal. If you go over to the right-hand side of the graph, people like Romania, Bulgaria, Italy, where it's a little bit lower, it's top 80s. And if you were to step outside of Europe, you would see that change quite a lot. But the main thing to take from this is that the vast majority of people are using the internet very regularly. And if you were to look at who this missing 1% are, you would very much be thinking about, of course, there's a group of people who may choose not to, but you would perhaps be thinking about people in rural areas where the connection is very poor, people in poverty with less income, where they're not able to afford phones and internet connections. And that's probably quite severe poverty. So you're talking about a lot of the things that might come hand in hand with that, like being involved with social care or the youth justice system. But really, you're very much talking about a very large amount of young people who are online and do have internet access. But that's important to pick that apart a little bit. If you look at this, tells you the same thing, but it's about number of people using a computer, and you see it drop slightly. You're really talking more like 75% of people using a computer day to day. And if you compare that to the number of people who use mobile devices, then that goes right back up again. What that's telling you is it's about type of internet connection is one of the things that's very important to think about, and type of device connection. And I have a sense that what we do a lot in youth work and digital youth work at the moment is we design sessions very much like this one that are built around the idea that someone is sat at a computer and that they're able to move from browser screen to browser screen, and they can easily stream video. And of course, if you're accessing on a mobile device or a tablet, maybe there's someone in the room who is, and if that's your main device that you have at home, that's much more challenging to engage in this type of interaction. Or perhaps if you have internet access, but you don't have a large amount of data, it's much harder to stream video content extensively. But generally, I think you can have an assumption that a lot of people do have a connection, and what you're thinking about is the quality. The next you can think about is whether the tools and the platforms that we're using are accessible. So we saw two things that came up in your chats. One was the idea of digital skills, young people not having the skills to use these platforms to engage with them. And this is a graph from Eurostat, which is about young people with basic digital skills and how many young people have them. And you see the figures start to drop off a little bit here, and it's very much links to the same patterns country-wise as to who had less internet access. But you're talking around 80 to 90% of people have what's described as basic internet skills. So you can be confident that a large amount of young people actually do have the skills to access digital technology. What's really important to think about this, though, when we're thinking about inclusion, is two things. One is, who are the young people that don't have these skills? And two is really what level of skills are needed. If you dig into this measurement, they're talking about some quite complicated digital skills. They're talking about programming, creating word processing documents, publishing videos online. The standard of a basic digital skill is actually quite high. So actually, I think we can challenge a little bit the notion that young people don't always, or a lot of young people don't have the skills to, say, interact in a WhatsApp group or a Facebook group or take part in a video call. And I think we can think about a good quality thing that's necessary in any youth work program is to simply build in teaching the skills that are necessary for that program, in the way that Limanus at the start of this session gave you a very thorough explanation of how to use Zoom. But at the same time, I still think you need to think a little bit about this missing gap here, about the people who these tools are really not well designed for and will be unlikely to be able to develop these skills. And that's a little bit for me where I start to think a little bit more around disability access particularly, and using features and tools and functions that are accessible to people from a variety of backgrounds. A colleague of mine, Roman Benari, has written a wonderful chapter on this in the knowledge book I referred to that'll be coming out soon. And he talks about the idea of, well, he talks about the web content accessibility guidelines, and he talks about making sure that whatever platform or tool you're using is perceivable, that the users should be able to perceive the content through their senses, that sight and hearing can effectively work with the interaction, that assistive technology such as screen readers will work with whatever you're doing. He talks about it being operable, that users should be able to interact with the technology if they're not using a standard keyboard, mouse or support or a device, that they might be using some sort of different impact device. And he talks about the importance of understanding, that the people involved in this understand and have the knowledge of what platform you're using, that they can engage with it. Now, of course, understanding is something you can build into your educational program and help people develop. But what's really important, and again, it comes back to this idea of what tools are people actually using, is the robustness of this, that whatever we put out should work on a wide range of technologies and a wide range of user agents. And user agents is a fancy word for device and browser combined together. So if you're making an online program and that the people using it are likely to not have hearing disabilities or sight disabilities, or they're more likely to be using a mobile phone, it's about making sure that the technology you're using is compatible to that. I don't think there's many good examples of doing this in the youth sector yet, actually. I think there's some specialist organisations that have managed it, but as a whole, we're not very good at it. And the final barrier I think we can think a little bit about, which is actually one we're much more probably comfortable thinking about, but for some reason don't talk about when we use digital tools in the youth work sector. And I think is something that is probably the main barrier, is the idea of whether the space that we're creating online is welcoming, inclusive, and whether it's safe for everyone that's involved. And so if you think about when you create a digital youth work program, if you're bringing a community of people together somehow to interact with each other, they're a network of individuals, maybe they connect primarily through this digital tool or this space. And if the ground rules you're putting down, the messages you're giving out, the way people are interacting is a way that's making people feel unsafe, maybe it's making them feel unwelcome, maybe there's hate speech, prejudice there, or maybe there's just an idea that a certain sort of space isn't for you. These are things that exclude people from a community. And I don't think I need to talk to you about this in much detail. I'm assuming you're all used to dealing with this kind of issue in a face-to-face setting. And actually, I think it's just as important when we work in a virtual setting to think about how do we make sure people feel welcomed in this space, that they feel looked after, that they feel respected. To give you a good example of that, I was doing a piece of work recently looking at young LGBTQIA plus young people's experiences online. And they were talking very much about how the internet to them felt like an inherently safe space. So what they would do when they engaged in different spaces was to go and find the communities, the Facebook groups, the WhatsApp chats, the meme pages, that they felt it was comfortable to talk about their identity, to reveal that they were LGBT young people, and that those were very positive spaces when they were in them. But in other parts of the internet, they could be very negative spaces where they were exposed to a lot of abuse, a lot of hate speech. That sort of stuff can happen online very easily because of the anonymity. And so if you are a youth worker building a program, you have to think about the fact that you are building a community and a space within which people interact. So the way you set down the ground rules, the way you communicate what values are reflected in that program, the way the staff behind it and the diversity is reflected in the people who are leading it, will affect whether people feel able to interact and engage with a space. There are lots of other barriers we could mention as well, but for me, this is the major sets of categories we could think about. So you've got the idea of, firstly, do people have the right connection and devices? Secondly, are those the tools and platforms you're using technically accessible from those devices? And thirdly, is the digital space you're creating inclusive and safe? I think in the youth sector at the moment, we make a little bit too much out of the device issue and the connection issue. It's a very important issue, but it's almost a little bit outside of the youth sector's control. We need to connect our entire population digitally, but I'm not sure that people who run non-formal education programs are likely to be the ones solving that issue. But I think actually what we do need to think a lot more about is how we create these spaces for interaction that are welcoming and that are technically accessible, that they're not too challenging, they don't require too much bandwidth. And of course, in that you can start to see, if we come back out of the presentation, some of the things you talked around on the Padlet around actually people using internet in their homes and feeling safe to talk about things while their parents are there, being able to negotiate and share spaces. This is my starter for 10. I'd be interested to know what people's feedback is and to how we might go about some of those challenges, really. I think that takes me up to my 15 minutes, Limonus, so I'm going to pause there.
Any reactions or questions to Dan, or a reflection to share?
It's very interesting where we are focusing and where maybe there is the biggest problem, no? This inclusiveness and safety. I would add one thing on the top for me. Of course, this is the basic, no? The inclusiveness and the safety. And I would say that as there is so much online, it was underlined by someone, no? There is so much online. I would say that also to make something attractive. So it's to create an environment which is really attracting is a difficulty. If we don't manage to attract with something, with some spirit, with something that is making the people come, it's also a possibility of being out.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that entirely. I would probably put it in a slightly different box to inclusion, in the sense that you have to make it something worthwhile for people to be there, that they get something out of in the first place to make them interesting for people, for sure. And I almost have a feeling that the last sort of 4 or 5 months through COVID, or however long it's been, 6 months, we jumped straight into, okay, can we run this informal education session in a way where we can get through the tasks? And now we know we're in for a much longer period. There's a real question of how do we put the fun into that? How do we really acknowledge that the reason people came to our youth programs, one of the big reasons was they were able to hang out informally, and they were able to, we've all maybe run things like youth exchanges, and we all know that although we don't write it on our official timetable, what happens in the evenings is a key part of why people want to go. So that's a real big challenge going forward, really, is to put the interest back into things. What I found is really useful to start talking to people about, almost to move away from this idea of what's the right tool, is to think about what are we trying to do with those tools? What are we trying to create? And to think about the different, what you might call modes of youth work and modes of community building we might do online. Because I think there's an assumption to jump towards, this is always about organizing a video chat between 10 people, which is the equivalent of sitting in a circle with your youth work practice. And Limonus and I were just joking about, if you had a youth club where as soon as people came through the door, what they had to do was sit in the circle and have a really intense discussion, that'd be a really exhausting youth club to be in if you were hanging out there all day or something like that. So for me, I want to give you a few ideas about how you might think about the idea of the space or the community that you're trying to create. I'll share my screen again, which I think maybe then after that we can have a bit of discussion around what does that look like in terms of then making that space inclusive. And so these are just a few different kind of ideas, and I'll go through them one by one in terms of the way I think about the different modes of online youth work. It's always important for me to give a recognition to, I think, Martin Fisher from Game Over Hate here, who I've stolen many of these ideas from. But that's perhaps, we can call it a meme, maybe we built on each other's ideas. The first one you can think of is broadcasting. And we had a couple of questions earlier about what channels do we use to communicate with young people about our project? Okay, so the first mode you can think of is broadcasting. And this is very much when you're just telling people about your projects. You might be you're publishing information, say social media channels, through email campaigns. It's a one-way conversation. You're giving information out either about a project or a program that's starting, or perhaps you're just giving advice information, like maybe you're offering a website that gives sexual health advice or career advice. And this is very much quite easy to imagine. It links to youth information quite a lot, but it's an important sort of way to distinguish one type of work online. And I saw someone in the earlier Padlet asking, how do we know what channels to engage with young people when we want to inform them about what's coming up? And generally the kind of accepted wisdom if you work in communications, and this is effectively what this is, that you use as many channels as possible. You reproduce the content a lot of times, you send it out frequently, and you would focus on the channels that your audience is on a lot more. So it's actually quite easy if you just Google which social media platforms do young people use in your country, you'll probably find that information quite quickly. You can take a step up from that and think a little bit about building virtual communities. So this might be where you're publishing content or information that goes out, but you're also inviting interaction, either back with you as the youth worker or between people. And the example of this you might use might be, if you think about it in a non-youth worker setting, the way a YouTuber or an influencer creates a piece of content and gets people to talk to them about that content, to discuss with each other what's going on. And in a way, when you do this sort of thing, what you're doing is building up the presence of your channel, the presence of your organization's profile, and getting people to come and interact with it bit by bit. And this sort of interaction can happen in a few different ways. It can happen in what you might call the public space, where you're just putting out content on Facebook or Instagram or TikTok that anyone can interact with. But you can also make a sort of semi-private space where you might be encouraging people to join an ongoing Facebook group, maybe a Discord channel, maybe a Slack channel or a WhatsApp group, where it's a sort of invite-only space, or it takes a little bit of a jump to get into. And in that kind of space, you can curate the safety of it a little bit more. You can take people out of the space, you can ban them, you can set a set of ground rules down for how people interact. And so this kind of large-scale virtual community building is, I think, one of the ways that we can think about how we bring a large community of people together to discuss and to interact with each other. And an important part of this is it might not always be synchronous, it might be asynchronous, so that you would have, in one of the programs I'm running, for example, it's a program for young people with chronic illness. We have a series of WhatsApp channels that people just talk to each other through and can interact. And we might publish a challenge where we say, we'd like people to share their experiences of doing advocacy work. And they will talk to each other through those channels. But when I turn off my phone at night, that channel is still there and it's still active. It's a sort of semi-permanent space. You can contrast that with what we're doing right now, which is more like group work. Although this is a very large group, the idea of having a video chat that you're all taking part in, that you're all expected to be there at the same time, in real time, and it's scheduled, and you have to be invited to come into that sort of space. This is like the equivalent of having a circle for your youth work group. You can do some fantastic work in this setting, but it's tiring, it's exhausting, it needs very good structure, and it needs a purpose. So if you go, imagine like the spectrum of activities, you might have some activities that are about broadcasting, telling people what your programs are, some activities that are about gradually building them into interaction and having discussion together, perhaps inviting them into this sort of slightly closed space that exists about your project or your program. And then you might invite a smaller group of people, say, hey, we're running this session on sexual health or drugs education or whatever it is that's the topic of your program. And it runs on this time and at this date, and who wants to be involved? And then at the same time as that, the other side of things you might be offering as a youth worker would be one-to-one support. And again, if you imagine across all of these platforms, you would be communicating a space where people can interact with you when they have an issue, a crisis situation, or maybe when they need more help. They just need advice on how do they join that Zoom chat you've said is coming up next week. That they've got a way that they can reach out and have that one-to-one interaction with someone that they feel a little bit comfortable with. I think one of the important things about one-to-one work in an online space is recognizing you need to communicate very clearly when you're available and when you're not. You can give the impression that people can message you at 3 o'clock at night, 12 o'clock at night, and of course they can do that. But you need to really set some clear boundaries there around what are your expectations in terms of how you might offer that support back, how you might think of it. So I think for me, and then the final model you can think of is something that sits a little bit outside of this, which is very much orientated a bit more to formal learning. It's the idea of a learning management system. So this is something like Moodle, Canva, any of these platforms where you would join up, take part, you would read some things, watch some videos, answer some questions, and you're basically doing quite a structured learning experience through it. You might build in different levels of interaction with that. So in this kind of mode, you're not really building a community as strongly, but it is a good way for teaching, basically. I use that word lightly because you can do non-formal education with it. So the sort of question for me when I start to think about how do we make the communities we're creating inclusive, and how do you make them interactive, is not to go to what tools are we using, but to go to what sort of community and space are we trying to build. And a lot of these things, I don't think I need to tell this audience how to make group work inclusive and how to make people valued in a group workspace. I think you know how to do that from your face-to-face experience. But I think you can stretch some of those skills out a little bit to think about how you might build slightly larger virtual communities and what messages you might want to give out if you're broadcasting. So for me, this is the sort of framework that I think is a good starting point for thinking about when you're going, okay, which one of these am I trying to do in my program? And therefore, which tools will be the right tools for creating that sort of thing? And that's a whole different session. And then you can go, how do I make that space I've created inclusive? How do I remove the barriers that would make that inaccessible? And so if you know that some basic rules for removing those barriers could be, first of all, taking stock of who actually has digital access in the real community of people you're trying to work with in the real world. And so knowing who a choice to deliver digitally will more likely to exclude and who it won't. Thinking mobile first rather than desktop first is always a good stance to do, but it being accessible to both is even better. And building in that kind of skills development and training, not in the sense of we have to really strongly equip everyone with a wide range of digital skills, but that when people join your virtual community or your Zoom chat or your learning management space, you have something that onboards them into that space that tells them this is how this works, this is where you can get support from, this is who we are, this is how you interact with other people. In the same way as when you start a youth program, you would have some sort of induction, icebreaker kind of sessions, telling people where the toilets are and where the fire escape is, having that as a matter of course in all of your interactions. Those are my kind of starters for 10. There's a lot more to think about as a youth work community in all of this. There's a lot more to think about, particularly in terms of disability access and really assessing which tools are accessible and making modifications so that they can be much more widely accessible. But I think for me, to step up to thinking around how do we build communities and how do we make those inclusive is probably the route forward for thinking about that. I hope that's been useful to everyone. Yeah, I think that's probably my time done on this section.
Thanks a lot, Dan. Yeah, I find it really useful insights and giving some food for thought on the way we organize youth work. And I think it's an ongoing process for everyone to really see what are the good things in terms of principles and values that we can bring from residential experiences to an online to digital youth work, but also not to try to replicate 100% because it's totally different environment where people experience different feelings and they behave differently online. And also for me, it's an invitation to always dig and stay curious what is out there, what other fields are doing, how other communities are being created and function already actually for many years. And some of the communities are only online. So it's for me always interesting really to dig there and understand the principles, how they build, how they keep the relationship going on for longer, and what we can learn and take back to the youth work settings, still keeping the work and mission that youth work has.